This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This is the latest episode in a series co-sponsored by the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, and I am delighted to be joined again, this time in the studio, by Professor David N. Myers, who holds the Kahn Chair. Professor Myers is Distinguished Professor of Jewish History, as well as the Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Hello, David. It's good to have you back.
Great to be here, Gilad, in studio.
In the studio. Our guest today is a scholar of modern Jewish history, a Polonsky Post-Doctoral Fellow at the Leer Jerusalem Institute, and he teaches at the Open University and Sapir College. His book, Binyamin, Binationalism and Counter-Zionism, was published last year in Hebrew by the Zalman Shazar Center. Dr. Avi-Ram Tzoreff, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, Gilad. Hello, David.
Thank you for coming. So, Rabbi Binyamin was a unique character, single-handedly advocating a type of politics that you call Counter-Zionism. Can you tell us who he was and explain what Counter-Zionism means?
I'll begin with saying that my main goal was not to suggest Rabbi Binyamin as a unique character, but rather as one who's can play as an axis through which we can write a broader critical analysis of the historiography of Zionism. So, some words about Rabbi Binyamin. Rabbi Binyamin, who was born as Yoshua Redler Feldman, Rabbi Binyamin is a pseudonym, pen name. He was born as Yoshua Redler Feldman in the town Zborov in Habsburg, Galicia, in 1880. He was an observant Jew, one of the prominent figures in the circle of modern Hebrew literature, in the circles of religious Zionist parties such as the Mizrahi and the Poel Mizrahi, and maybe the most important thing, which is the main focus of the book, is the fact that he was one of the prominent figures in the circle of the binational movements from the 20s on in mandatory Palestine. If we take as examples Brit Shalom and Kedma Mizracha and the League for Jewish-Arab Rapprochement and afterwards Ichud, it was the one who's also after the establishment of the State of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba in 1948, continued to hold the binational concept and political perspective as the basis for political resistance, while establishing the journal Ner, a candle, through which he voiced the demand for the return of Palestinian refugees, the demand for the dismantled and the abolition of the military rule against Palestinian citizens in Israel, and also something we might return to in the end, advocated a policy of active neutralism in the global politics of the Cold War. So Rabbi Binyamin is a figure that connects different fields of analysis, these fields of religion and secularism in the history of Zionism, the sphere of Jewish-Arab relations, the sphere of modern Hebrew literature, and also the history of Jewish existence in the multinational empires, in the Habsburg Empire and in the Ottoman Empire. And it enables us to create the connection between these fields, which usually are being separated in scholarship of Jewish history.
So he was the connective tissue of these different worlds that you've described, right? Modern Hebrew literature, religious Zionism, the binationalist world. And you've begun to help us understand the world in which he operated. Who were his partners? Who were his friends? Who were his conversation partners in these various pursuits? You said that he isn't unique, but he's sort of representative of something. What's the world around which Rabbi Binyamin built his vision?
Let's try to draw some of the circles in these different fields. And let's begin in the binational or the advocates of Jewish-Arab cooperation, because if we will remain within the scope of only the binational movements, which were established only in 1925, Brit Shalom, the first one, we might forget the earlier phases of this notion, in which Rabbi Binyamin is an integral part of the colonization efforts of the Zionist movement. He was an official in the Palestinian office led by Dr. Arthur Rupin, who enhanced or articulated the settler colonial Zionist policies of conquest of land, conquest of labor, the creation of a distinct Jewish geography and a distinct Jewish economy within Palestine. And as an official of the Palestinian office, Rabbi Binyamin was part of the press bureau of the office, and he worked together with Nissim Malul and Aharon Mani. Nissim Malul and Aharon Mani belonged to the circles of Sephardi Jewish intellectuals, Palestinian Sephardi Jewish intellectuals.
That was in the very beginning of the 20th century, right?
Yes, this is in the first decade. It's in 1910. It's the beginning of the work of this department. And Nissim,
so still under Ottoman rule.
Still under Ottoman rule. And especially Nissim Malul was one of these circles of this Sephardi indigenous populations critique of Zionist separatist policies regarding Palestinian Arabs. And I think that we can draw some similarities between Rabbi Binyamin's discourse within these years, which criticizes the policies enhanced by the very organization which he belongs to, of the conquest of the land, of the creation of a segregated economy. So this is one circle that we can articulate.
Can I continue on this strand for a minute? Because what you say, his rejection of this separatist politics of Zionism at the time, and still to this very day, in fact, is something that he brought along with him from Galicia, his sort of imperial outlook on politics, still at the very beginning of the 20th century. And in a way, it was not very Zionist in the sense that he negated the negation of the exile, that he sort of brought this diasporic state of mind with him into Palestine, not just into Palestine, but also into Zionist activism.
Yeah, so I doubt to call it diasporic. I'm not sure. I am trying to explain why. So let's begin with what aspects in his Galicianness played role in the articulation of binationalism. So I think that the emergence of Galicia between 1772 until 1918 as an Habsburg district was connected to different processes that created Galicia as the local center for identification for Galician Poles, Ruthenians, and Jews, the main three segments of Galician population. Alongside this center for identification existed two other centers of identification. One is the civic imperial Habsburg center of identification with the Imperial Center in Vienna. And the other one is the more limited collective center of identification of Jews and Ruthenian and Poles alike. Now, within the district itself, of course, power relations have existed. And I think one of the, if we do speak of the uniqueness of Rabbi Binyamin, is the fact that while Jews mainly had fluent German or Polish, Rabbi Binyamin also adopted and studied to speak Ruthenian. So he was acquainted with the language of the vast majority of the peasantry of the Ruthenians in Galicia, and therefore he created or he understood the way to autonomy or to about political liberation within the scope of the empire, within the scope of the local district, and as something which needs to bring into consideration the whole reparation of the status of the power relations within the district itself. And I think when he migrated from Galicia to Ottoman Palestine, he was acquainted with a similar imperial structure that indigenous Jewish Palestinian population was acquainted with. Because the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire went through similar political reforms, and I don't want to picture it as an idyllic transformation of these political structures, but I want to emphasize the difference between the structure of the multinational empires, in which there was not an overlap between territory and ethnicity, while in the nation state that will be built on the ruins of these empires, there was an attempt to create this overlap between territory and ethnicity, and which created, in the context of the Habsburg Empire, what we call the problem of minorities following World War I, and the fact that in the colonized areas, in these areas that the colonial forces occupied from the Ottoman Empire, they weren't granted with the right of self-determination. So these two transformations after the First World War are important facts to understand the way in which the logic of the multinational empire served as a basis for the critique of the new global political order as was manifested in the new situation in Palestine.
And a critique of mainstream streams of Zionism as well. And this is what is so interesting about the transfer of the Galician model, the multinational imperial model, to Palestine in Rabbi Binyamin, because it led to, amongst other things, his opposition to the very idea of the fulfillment of Zionism in the form of a nation state. It also included his territorial maximalism, which I hope you will explain, and yet at the same time he defined himself as a Herzlian. So how does one put these various pieces together? I mean, we could assume that he was a kind of diasporous nationalist who happened to be in Palestine, advocating cultural autonomy for the Jewish people. But it was a more complicated vision than that. I wonder if you can help complicate it for us.
So let's begin maybe with his Herzlianism. Rabbi Binyamin was maybe the most vocal advocate of Herzlian Zionism in the way that he thought that there are persecuted Jews in Europe and there is a need in a mass migration of millions of Jews into the geographical area. And what is this geographical area? This was something which he articulated in a different way than the dominant stream of Zionism. And I try to explain. While dominant Zionism saw the reliance on the colonial British authorities that guarantees its aspirations, political aspirations, in the form of the Balfour Declaration, within the limited area that became to be known as Mandatory Palestine, Rabbi Binyamin, as part of his acquaintance with anti-colonial Palestinians and Arab perceptions, became to identify the regional spectrum which should be seen as the goal or as the region to which these millions of persecuted Jews should migrate to. He identified in the whole region between Basra and Jaffa, in which he continued, which he used the phrase of Muhammad Roshan Akhtar, who was a Muslim Indian who served as the editor of the English edition of the Palestinian newspaper Palestine, the most circulated Palestinian newspapers in this period, which claimed in one of his lectures to the members of Brit Shalom in 1931 that you should overcome your aspiration to create a sovereign entity within the borders of biblical Judea. You should overcome your spirit of a conqueror, because in this limited area you can't fulfill your aspiration to rescue this million of persecuted Jews. You need to change your regional scope from this colonial boundaries to the broader scope of Basra to Jaffa. And this change of regional scope will bring, firstly, to your identification with the anti-colonial Arab struggle, which one of its main issues is the resistance to the colonial act of bisecting the whole Arab region. And secondly, you can stay out of acts of displacement, of expulsion, of Palestinian peasants.
In that regard, he was very un-Herzlian insofar as the vision of Herzl was not just to rescue Jews suffering from anti-Semitism in Europe, but of course to create a state of the Jews. And what we're talking about here is a political entity that is marked by the antithesis of separation, but rather integration of Jews and Arabs together in some political form that extends beyond the boundaries of Eretz Israel, of the land of Israel.
And also rejection of the nation-state model that everyone was aspiring to at the time.
He himself saying that he renews Herzl's vision in a different hue in one of his articles. And I think if Herzl saw the Zionist movement as a European stronghold in Asia, in his Judenstadt, Rabbi Binyamin sees the fact that the Jews, or as David said, are becoming integrated into the political entity that Arabs will establish in the broader region of the Middle East. And he crystallizes a different theological notion of what is Eretz Israel. And this notion of Eretz Israel creates a different hierarchy of importance of Jewish existence in the lands that are close or adjacent to Eretz Israel, to Palestine, and other lands that are distant from Palestine. So he sees a clear difference between Jewish existence in Damascus or in Baghdad and Jewish existence in New York, for example. Since the Jewish existence in Baghdad, or I'm using his frameworks, in Albania or Cyprus, and of course we can see here the borders of the Ottoman Empire plays a very important role, he sees it as something that creates the centrality of Palestine, because this is a geographical continuum while Jewish existence in Western Europe or in the United States or in Latin America or in Australia are different, are occurring. And this is one of his, in the end of the 30s, it's one of his, maybe here we come to the difference between diasporic perception and his own binational perception. He emphasized it in one of his controversies with Simon Ravidovich, who is one of the central figures in David's research. And
who was also concerned about the status of Palestinian refugees.
And of course,
uniquely or in one of a small number of people, Jews in the 1950s.
Yes, and we can see a lot of similarities between these two figures. But in 35, I think, he writes against
the vision of Babylon and Jerusalem.
Babylon of Jerusalem, the Ravidovich notion of Babylon and Jerusalem, of the American existence, as something which should prevail, and another alongside the Palestinian center. And Rabbi Binyamin says no. But he says no, not because his own negation of exile, of Rabbi Binyamin himself, doesn't relate to Jewish existence in the Middle East. Jewish existence in the Middle East is not exile, according to Rabbi Binyamin.
He's a kind of Canaanite, avant la lettre, in a sense.
And interestingly, in 1938, Yonatan Ratosh, the leader of the Canaanites, of the young Hebrews, called himself and says, I didn't see you answering or responding to our manifesto of our Committee for the Christianization of the Hebrew youth. And you should be interested in our vision. Now, I don't have Rabbi Binyamin's response for Ratosh, but I think I can figure out what he would have responded to Ratosh's letter, because in a very interesting way, of course, was similar to Ratos's vision in this regional scope, in the fact that this is something which it's connected to Palestine as a center, but Rabbi Binyamin would have not agree with Ratos's notion of negating both Judaism and Islam as manifestations of the current situation of Jews and Arabs in this region, and this artificial attempt to return to the early Eastern cultures.
Because the Canaanites were, of course, eminently secular in this sense, and Rabbi Binyamin, as I say, was a religious Zionist, and of course placed a lot of emphasis on religion, Jewish, of course, but as you show, also on Islam, and he discussed Sharia as some sort of basis for political common action between Jews and Arabs. Can you describe his attitude towards religion?
Okay, so I think it changed in different phases of his career. But now, if we are trying to identify the first manifestation of this connection of Judaism and Islam as what should seen as the basis for Jewish-Arab cooperation, we can find it on his maybe the most famous article of Rabbi Binyamin, I think one of his weakest articles, the Sermon on Arabia, Masa Arav, which was published in The Awakener, HaMe'orer, which was one of the most important literary journals in the first decade of the 20th century, which he, together with Yosef Chaim Brenner, were the editors of this journal in London, 1906 to 1907. And in 1907, following strong resistance from Brenner to this article, Brenner thought it wasn't worth of publishing, but later he published it because he didn't have something to publish. So
that's how most things get published.
Yeah. So in this article, one of the great sentences in this article is, and I'm using the Shem Adnut because he uses the tetragrammaton explicitly in this article. Adonai hu Elohim u'Muhammad haya nevi'o. That's to say,
The Lord is our
the
God.
Lord is the God, which is taken from the Jewish prayer of Yom Kippur, and
Muhammad is his
messenger, which is taken from the Muslim Shahada. So this amalgamation was seen by him as the basis for a Jewish-Arab cooperation in Palestine, which in this article he criticizes only briefly. He is still, in 1907, we can't figure out exactly how much he is acquainted with the whole settler colonial structure of the Zionist movement in Palestine, which will be articulated in his very bold structure only in 1908 after the establishment of the Palestinian office, which we mentioned before. And later, like in the 20s, for example, we see this notion through different aspect when he relates to the holy places, mainly to Meron, to the Hilula in Meron, to the celebration of Lag BaOmer in Meron, when he sees it as a local celebration. And he has an article in his Haredi newspaper, which he edited since 1927 until his death in 1957, a newspaper which was oriented towards non-Zionist Orthodox readership, Hahed, the Echo, and he has an article there which is called Lag BaOmer Ba'aretz, Lag BaOmer in our country, and he tries to picture what is Lag BaOmer as a local celebration against the Zionist secular notion of Lag BaOmer, which trying to de-emphasize, also in religious Zionist circles, to de-emphasize the prominent role of Rashbi, of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, in this notion of Lag BaOmer, in this, and Rabbi Binyamin, he trying to pictures the preparations of the train company and the way in which different population are gathering in Meron to come to the tomb of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Meron. So in this phase, we can see the amalgamation of different local traditions about the holy places as the main thing through which the binational understanding of Jewish existence in Palestine is articulated.
So the way in which he understands himself as a Zionist, together with the way in which he deviates from Zionist orthodoxies, raises the question about settler colonialism, which is such an important part of the analytic frame of your book. You understand Zionism as a settler colonial project. So can you tell us what you mean by that and whether Rabbi Binyamin was part of that project or stood apart from it?
So
we've articulated many ways in which he deviates from the norm.
Yeah, so
and yet he works for the Palestine office, which is the chief colonialist.
So he's at one and the same time part of the colonization effort and a critique or maybe dissident maybe of the colonization effort. And we can picture like three main phases, if we, of how the Zionist settler colonial repertoire is practiced. The first one is the late Ottoman period, when the Zionist uses the fact that the capitalization or the privatization of the Ottoman lands from the land tenure in 1858, which enables the Zionist movement to occupy lands and expel the Palestinian peasants that are living in these lands. So this is something that enables this colonization process. This deviates from something which was like the well-known unwritten agreement that while land ownership transforms from one to another, the people who are living on the land are staying on the land. What the Zionist movement deviates from this unwritten agreement is the fact that when the Zionist movement purchase lands, it also expel and displace the Palestinian peasants that are living in those lands, and that this is also one of the main bases for the Palestinian resistance in the second decade of the 20th century. Mainly, we can start in 1908, but it's seen more manifestations in 1911 and onwards. And apart from the purchase of lands, it's also the creation of segregated economy, which I mentioned before, which involves also the proletarianization of Mizrahi Jews, in the first case, Yemenites, which are brought by the Palestinian office in 1911 to take the role of the conquest of labor from the Arabs in the Jewish colonies. And Rabbi Binyamin is also an important official in the absorption of the Yemenite Jews in the colonies, while at the same time a very important oppositional figure to the racial discourse led by Rupin regarding the Yemenites as natural workers. And really, Rabbi Binyamin is elected in 1920, is elected as one of the representative of the Yemenites in the
decidedly Ashkenazi Rabbi Binyamin.
Yes, yeah. So he is elected by. Now we should relate to this election as with a grain of salt, but I think he was considered by the Yemenites as a different figure in the establishment of the Palestinian office. So this is the first phase of the settler colonial.
Right. No. So he is external to pretty much every circle that he was in. And I wonder...
To which he belonged.
Yeah, exactly. To which he belonged, yeah. And I wonder to what extent was he really influential? Did he have anyone to talk to that didn't disagree with him?
I mean, I just want to add, he would seem to be the natural conversation partner for a well-known list of people who stood on the margins of the Zionist project, like Judah Magnus and Ernst Simon and Martin Buber and Shmuel Hugo Bergman and Moshe Kalvarisky.
But even with them, he had very little agreement, as you show.
I don't know if he had very little agreement. Okay. So let's and we are. It takes us for the second phase of and who are now the partners, because like Nissim Malul, which we mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, after the 20s, when Sephardi intellectuals lost their status as Ottoman citizens, which was very important for their opposition to the Zionist movement, they became only intermediaries. They lost much of their critical capacity against the Zionist movement. But of course, some of them remained within the binational scope, such as Yosef Meyuchas, for example, or Yitzhak Rafael Molcho, was also one of the main figures, prominent figures in the binational movements also until the 50s. But in the binational movements that are established during the mandatory period, in light of Zionist reliance on colonial authority, we are not speaking on an authority which only enables the Zionist colonization effort, but we are with an authority that actively supports the Zionist movement.
And we should add that Rabbi Binyamin was the first critic of the British colonial regime.
Yes, and what was the background for the establishment of Brit Shalom? So in mainstream Zionist historiography, it's been read as something, as a Zionist internal issue. The revisionists are established in 1925, and then Brit Shalom is established in 1925. But actually, Brit Shalom, if we are reading their materials from this period, Brit Shalom is established in light of the broad anti-colonial resistance struggle globally, they acknowledge the anti-colonial global struggle in the Indian subcontinent, in the Rif War in Morocco, and mainly the Syrian revolt in 1925. And Binyamin and Hugo Bergman are calling the Zionist movement, see how these struggles influence the Palestinian population. These must be the people with whom you negotiate, not the British colonial authorities. You don't want to see the Zionist movement as a metonym for the English colonial rule, but this is the current situation. The Zionist movement is seen as the long hand of the...
So that experience provides the foundation, or a important foundation, for his binationalism, which very significantly continues through the entirety of his life, including after the creation of the State of Israel, which connects to his deep concern for the status of Palestinian refugees. In that regard, there were very few who didn't accept the decree of history, as Buber put it in an essay in, I think, 1949. What was that world like for Rabbi Binyamin? Maybe that's the third phase of the response to the question about settler colonialism. What was that like, and how did he hold on to that and make his way to the refugee question?
Yes. So if we move from the phase of a settler colonial movement that acts without the passive support of the authorities, it turns to a phase in which it enjoyed the support of the colonial authorities, but it's still a colonial authorities and a settler colonial movement, which have sometimes different interests. And after 48, it becomes a settler state, which is established on the act of displacement of 770,000 of the indigenous Palestinian population. And here, the binational foundation of Rabbi Binyamin is playing the role of the critique of the very structure of the settler state. And this has four main aspects. The first is the demand for the return of the Palestinian refugees. Here, his companions are also former veterans of the binational movement from the mandatory period, but also several important figures from the population that became the Palestinian citizens of Israel under military rule. For example, the lawyer Elias Kusa, or the members of parliament such as Rostam Bastuni. We can draw a different social circle, which creates the binational political critique and understanding and political acts.
So before 1948, actually, I think you answered my question for after 1948, but before 1948, and I want to go back to the question of influence and reach. I mean, you talked about the Zionist circles, the different Zionist circles that it was in, but it's really hard to think of anyone from within the Zionist establishment or circles who reached out to the Palestinian Muslim Arabs to the extent that he has. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. Was his appeal answered by anyone of substance before 1948? His call for binationalism, for a joint, maybe religious basis for political action, etc.
From the Zionist movement?
No. From Arab Palestinians.
So one of the major questions is whether there was a binational Arab movement in Palestine. And here I also want to quote Eli Osherov's important article about whether there was a binational Arab movement. And Eli, one of his arguments is that we should, and it's also, we also made our researches were written like together. So one of Eli's arguments, I think, which is very important, is the fact that when we are speaking about binationalism from Palestinian perspective, we should understand it differently from the way we are concerning with binationalism when we are speaking from a Zionist perspective. Because from a Palestinian perspective, it's a pragmatic attempt to call for this settler movement, hold on with your colonization effort, come and be an integral part from an independent Arab political framework. Come, get your collective and individual rights, and participate in our struggle for liberation and independence. This is something that Hamdi al-Husseini, one of the important figures in Palestinian politics in the 20s and 30s, one of the who was also the secretary of the Arab states in the Anti-Imperialist League, which was established in 1927 in Brussels, and became afterwards one of the prominent members in the Palestinian Istiqlal party. He sends Rabbi Binyamin a letter in which he calls for Jewish participation in Palestinian and Arab struggle for liberation. And I can't say that I am satisfied with Rabbi Binyamin's response, because Hamdi al-Husseini pictures all the aspects of what Rabbi Binyamin wrote during this period. But when a Palestinian figure, a very prominent Palestinian figure, put it on the table, he tries to, his response includes like, you should relate to every Jewish as a Palestinian, as a potential Palestinian, because we are persecuted in Europe, and I acknowledge the fact that it creates a lot of problems, which I'm dealing with, of course, the problems of expulsion and displacements. And this, I think this, for one who was engaged in this writing, this response is very disappointing. Is something when the suggestion is on the table, and the question should be, and I am continuing, questions should be in a similar way to this one, not whether there was a Palestinian echo, yeah, but whether there was any chance that the dominant or the hegemonic stream of the Zionist movement will agree to these notions. And we can say that when Chaim Margaliot Kalvarisky was mentioned earlier by David, came with one program to Ben-Gurion saw it as a pigul, a desacralization of the Zionist aspirations.
This leads to what, alas, is our final question. It's been a fascinating conversation, and the book is so rich and really brings to life this complicated, multidimensional, and under-researched figure. And I want to just conclude on a very personal. You've brought him to life. To what extent do you like and identify with Rabbi Binyamin? And connected to that, what do you think he teaches us about the present?
What brought me as one who grew up in a religious Zionist family, a religious Zionist that was identified with the leftist streams of religious Zionism, which became to know as Meimad, which was mainly concentrated in controversies with Gush Emunim, whether conquest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is something which Jews must support or not, but wasn't in any opportunity try to evaluate, to develop a more broad critique of Zionist settler colonialism. Rabbi Binyamin gave me, as one who, when this notion of Meimad also lost its appeal during the Second Intifada, when I became, I was in my youth years. So Meimad it has no language to articulate its opposition, not to the religious Zionist right and not to the Israeli right at all. And what I found in Rabbi Binyamin was also its relation to a broader critique of the settler colonial Zionist repertoire, his relation to Torah and commandments as something which can develop and can play a role in the Christianization of this critique, his relation to other important issues such as ethnic stratification in Israel. And I think Rabbi Binyamin's perspective gives us also from this bleeding moment which we are speaking from, gives us in 1956 in his sermon to our brother, the infiltrator. He said, we called our war with you, our brother, the war of liberation. This wasn't a war of liberation, it was a war of enslavement. And he calls for...
So he's talking to a Palestinian refugee?
Yes, who were called by Israel infiltrators, which were trying to return to their lands. Most of them only trying to return to their land, and Israel violently shooting every single one of them. And Rabbi Binyamin changes the notion on infiltrator of a mistanen and calls him an immigrant, a ma'apil, the one who breaks...
A good Zionist term.
Yes, the one who breaks the law which is unjustified in order to return to his lands. And I think if this is our perspective, if we can understand the violence which is embedded within a colonial situation, the way in which the colonial situation creates violence inherently, I think we can set the horizon, the political horizon that can bring to its change to something better.
All right. Dr. Avi-Ram Tzoreff, author of Rabbi Binyamin, Binationalism and Counter-Zionism, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Gilad.
And many thanks to you, David, as well.
Great to be here, Gilad.
As well as Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.